On a Prayer. Faith is Awaken by Elton Thomas. Episode 10, Chains of the Past. Roxy Fuller sat at the edge of a worn leather couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white from the pressure. The low hum of the old space heater rattled in the corner of the small apartment, filling the silence that had settled between her and Dusty. The apartment was modest, with mismatched furniture and peeling wallpaper, but it was clean, much cleaner than the life she had come from. Roxy's dirty blonde hair fell in loose waves around her face, her tired eyes fixed on the floor. Her posture was rigid, tense, as if she were bracing herself for some unseen blow. Dusty sat across from her, leaning forward in the wooden chair that creaked under his weight, his elbows resting on his knees. His face was serious, his light brown eyes studying her intently, waiting for her to speak. He had seen Roxy like this before. Haunted, scared. But tonight, something felt different. Tonight, the walls she had built around herself seemed closer to crumbling. She didn't want to talk about it. That much was clear. But Dusty needed her to. He needed to know the full story, the one she had been avoiding for as long as he had known her. The story of how she had crossed paths with Jackson Brown. The name alone was enough to make Dusty's blood boil. Jackson was a ghost in the city's underworld, feared, powerful, and ruthless. And somehow Roxy had escaped him, though she had never fully explained how. Dusty had known bits and pieces over the years, fragments of a life that had nearly destroyed her. But tonight, he needed to hear the truth. Because somewhere in that truth was the key to finding Mila. Roxy's lips pressed into a thin line as she finally looked up, her eyes meeting Dusty's with a mixture of fear and resignation. "You want to know how I got away from him?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dusty nodded, his gaze steady, unwavering. "I need to know, Roxy. If we're going to find Mila, I need to know everything." Roxy swallowed hard, her throat tight as the memories she had buried for years clawed their way back to the surface. She hadn't wanted to remember. She hadn't wanted to relive the nightmare. But Dusty had been there for her when no one else had. He had pulled her out of the darkness, given her a second chance when she thought she didn't deserve one. She owed him this. "I was 17, Roxy began, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I'd been living on the streets for about a year by then. I had no money, no family, no one who cared whether I lived or died." She paused, her hands tightening in her lap, her gaze distant as she recalled the girl she had been, the girl who had believed she was worthless. "That's when Jackson found me," she continued, her voice hardening. "He told me he could help, that he could give me a way out. And I believed him." Dusty's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He could hear the bitterness in Roxy's voice, the anger at herself for having trusted a man like Jackson. He had heard similar stories before, promises of safety, of money, of belonging. But they all ended the same way, with broken lives and shattered souls. "At first it was just little things," Roxy said, her voice growing more strained as the memories flooded back. "He'd give me a place to stay, food, clothes. He made me feel like I owed him for everything, like I couldn't survive without him. And I believed it." She shook her head, her fists clenching in her lap. Dusty could see the shame in her eyes, the deep, aching guilt that had weighed on her for so long. But this wasn't her fault. It never had been. "Then, things changed," Roxy whispered, her voice breaking. "He started telling me I had to work for him, that it was the only way to repay him. And that's when it got bad." Dusty leaned forward, his eyes softening. "Roxy, you don't have to—" "No." She cut him off, her voice sharp and pained. "You need to hear this." The silence that followed was heavy, the only sound the faint whir of the heater in the corner. Roxy's shoulders slumped, and she stared at the floor as she continued. "He started selling me, to men, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. He controlled everything, who I saw, where I went, what I did. I was his property." Dusty's fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding with a mix of fury and helplessness. He had heard stories like this before, but hearing it from Roxy, someone he cared about, someone who had fought so hard to reclaim her life, it tore him apart. But he stayed quiet, letting her speak. I wanted to leave, but I was too scared, Roxy admitted, her voice hollow. He told me if I ran, he'd kill me. And I believed him. He killed other girls who tried. I saw it. Her breath hitched, and she wiped at her eyes, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. Dusty's heart ached for her, for the girl she had been, trapped in a nightmare with no way out. I don't know why he let me live, Roxy whispered, her voice trembling. Maybe he thought I wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe I was too broken to run. But one night, I did. I ran. Dusty leaned in closer, his voice low and gentle. What happened? Roxy shook her head, her expression distant. I didn't know where to go. I just ran. For days, I stayed hidden. Slept in alleyways, under bridges, anywhere I thought he couldn't find me. But I knew he was looking. I knew he wouldn't stop. She took a deep breath, her fingers running through her tangled hair as she tried to hold herself together. I got lucky. I found a shelter. The people there, they helped me. They got me into a program, helped me disappear. That's how I survived. Dusty's throat tightened as he watched her, his heart heavy with the weight of her story. Roxy had been through hell, and yet here she was, alive, fighting, surviving. He admired her strength, her resilience, but he also knew that the scars she carried ran deep, and Jackson Brown was still out there, still preying on girls like her. Why didn't you ever tell me this before? Dusty asked softly, his voice filled with concern. Roxy shrugged, her eyes brimming with a mixture of guilt and shame. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want anyone to know. I wanted to forget. Dusty nodded, understanding the burden she had carried for so long. But this wasn't something she could outrun, not with Jackson still in control of the city's underworld. Roxy, he said gently, if we're going to take Jackson down, we need to do it together. We need to stop him. For Mila. For the other girls. For you. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for a moment, she looked like she was about to retreat back into the shell she had built around herself. But then, something changed. Her gaze hardened, her posture straightened, and she looked at Dusty with a fierceness that took him by surprise. I'm not running anymore, she said, her voice strong and resolute. If you're going after Jackson, I'm going with you. Dusty stared at her for a long moment, the determination in her eyes burning brighter than the fear that had once held her captive. He nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. They were going to take Jackson down. Together.